Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Carolyn Laubender, senior lecturer in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. And we're talking about her book, The Political Clinic, Psychoanalysis and Social Change in the 20th Century. Dr. Laubender, wonderful to have you on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So just kind of as a starting question, why this book? Why do we need this book? And what led you to kind of do this project? I assume that some of it has to do with, you have a really entertaining introductory story. Like I can feel the academic tension. Like I was like reading, I was like, oh, I felt that. Yeah, but anyways.
Absolutely. Yeah. So my answer kind of would come in two parts, and it does pick up a bit with the climate of that story. So I think the first part of the answer, and like the two parts are like, one is kind of in the clinical world, the psychoanalytic and even perhaps psychological clinical world. And then the other part of the question or answer is about the academic world and academic debates. So for the clinical side of things, there's since 2020, but I would say even before that in a more underground way, but since 2020, since the murder of George Floyd, and then increasingly today, as we kind of witness the genocide in Gaza, there's been a real sea change in the way that psychoanalytic institutes and psychoanalytic trainings and psychoanalysts are being asked to respond to the politics of their practice. So for a long time before that, I guess, so the story goes, there's been a really dominant understanding of psychoanalytic practice as being politically neutral or politically disengaged or objective. If you go through training institutes, especially the classic ones in the United States or in the United Kingdom, which are kind of object relational, which is a term I can talk about, and ego-oriented, which is also a term I can talk about, they're going to kind of, present the role of psychoanalysis as a conceptual apparatus, and then the analyst as kind of wanting to adopt a stance of disengagement, of neutrality, right? And that's, in their understanding, this is to kind of protect the patient and allow the patient their own space for exploration. But what we started to see, and what I think that had been kind of underground for many years before this, before the murder of George Floyd, but what you started to see in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and then now we see it increasingly with the situation in Palestine, is that especially young trainees, people who are kind of coming up, young people, I would say young people, people of color, people who are from minoritized backgrounds, poor folks, they're understanding that psychoanalytic practice actually can't be politically disengaged. And they're asking about its relationship to social justice. And this has led to a series of really intense debates within psychoanalytic societies, some of which have started making international news, believe it or not. There's a Guardian story from about a year ago that focuses on a professor and a clinical psychologist named Laura Sheehy, who I know well, and she's a kind of wonderful scholar, but who was being targeted for her position on Palestine and had been deplatformed from her role as one of the organizers of the American Psychoanalytic Association, where she was supposed to give a talk. And they sort of canceled her talk on war because of her political views. And this had mushrooming consequences, right? Because she spoke out on her own behalf. People came to her defense. It started making international news. This is just one of many different kind of local examples of the ways that kind of historically conservative institutes have been butting heads with folks who are demanding that they kind of account for the politics of their practice, and even to understand their practice as political in any way. So in that, the clinical answer is that the book is my attempt to understand the politics of psychoanalytic practice in a primarily historical, but also critical theoretical way. I come from a background in I'm an academic by training, right? I'm not a clinical practitioner, even though I work and train in clinical programs and departments now. But I come from a background in literary study and in history and critical theory. And so, when I was thinking about these questions for myself, I was really interested in like, okay, well, how do we get to this moment, right? Like, what is psychoanalytic practice if there's this fervent contingent that's saying that it's apolitical, and then this fervent contingent that is demanding that it, kind of account for its politics? Like, how do we arrive here? What has been the background of psychoanalytic practice, even going as far back as Freud? And so the book is it's a historical engagement with some of the, founding figures really of psychoanalysis in a post-Freudian tradition, specifically those figures who are associated with the British Psychoanalytical Society. So it's sort of a micro history of that society, but that society has huge impact on the shape of psychoanalysis globally. So that's the kind of clinical answer.
Well, and I would love for you, if you don't mind, sharing and maybe this is the academic, the story about shoot, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but you had a lady win an award and then call out the former president who's in the front row.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe that's the academic side of it. But obviously all this stuff is going to kind of flow together. I mean, even you've moved from academics to clinical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And they absolutely intersect for me. Maybe the kind of bifurcation is false to begin with. Yeah. So the story, you're naming the story that I kind of enter the book with in my introduction. And so this is a conference that I was at the Freud Museum in, I believe, 2019. So it's the conference title, and this conference series is still running, Psychoanalysis in the Public Sphere. I was invited to give a talk. A number of leading scholars in psychoanalytic theory and practice were also invited to give talks. It was a 2-day conference, very well attended. And it was my first time giving a talk at the Freud Museum, right? So I was a very junior scholar in comparison to a number of the folks that were there. So I gave my talk and that went fine, more or less. But the story that I tell is about kind of me sitting in the back row of the conference towards the very end of it, when I think everyone in the audience had felt tensions kind of mounting in the differences between the way that people were interpreting what psychoanalysis was. So that, these tensions had been mounting through the Q&A sessions, but it sort of came to a head when a very well-regarded psychoanalytic scholar and practitioner named Joanna Ryan.
Thank you.
She was on the closing plenary panel, like the roundtable panel at the end, and this climate of to what extent is psychoanalysis a politically progressive practice? In 2019, you can already feel that question emerging. And one of the things that Ryan is defending is the understanding that psychoanalysis, for instance, in relation to histories of lesbian and gay folks, psychoanalysis has had a really troubled past, right? It has been, especially in its American and some of its British iterations, it's done things like designate lesbian and gay folks as pathological, as having various kinds of psychopathologies, and it would some of the training institutes, including the British Psychoanalytic Society, would not allow openly gay and lesbian analysts to train there, right? In the understanding that they weren't psychologically healthy. And Joanna Ryan is a very publicly out lesbian analyst and was one of the first publicly out lesbian analysts to train and qualify at the British Psychoanalytical Society. And so in this moment that I describe, where I felt like in the conference that everything was sort of coming to a head, Joanna Ryan is responding to, more conservative criticisms that are arguing that psychoanalysis needs to be neutral or whatever. And she highlights the fact that, as a lesbian analyst, she had been pathologized, and that she had been kind of unduly limited in her engagement in psychoanalysis, right? That there had been deep homophobia present in the society, and that no one had apologized to her about it, right? Like that there had been, despite now, many of these same analysts who 15 years ago, 20 years ago, were pathologizing analysts like Joanna Ryan, just in spite of that, they were now saying, oh, but psychoanalysis is welcoming for everyone. We've always been progressive. We've always been, open arms. And Ryan is like, no, you have not been. Right? I can speak to my own experience. You have not been. And there hasn't been any engagement with the fact that, there was homophobia in the kind of prevention of me from engaging in training. And so she has this interaction with a member of the audience who's sitting in the front row. And this audience member's name is David Bell. And he's a former president of the British Psychoanalytical Society. And he has become very famous recently for his incredibly transphobic kind of position in relation to psychoanalysis. But if you look back in his archive, 15 years ago, he maintained that same sort of position in relation to homosexual, gay, and lesbian analysts. So Ryan is directly addressing David Bell in the audience, and she says, still no one has ever apologized to me for it. And so I begin the book with this anecdote because I feel like it's a kind of dramatic entry, but I feel like it captures something that I experience sort of on the everyday within psychoanalysis, which is you have a story about psychoanalysis, which is that like, oh, it's politically disengaged, or we're just kind of neutrally progressive. But then you have the long recorded history of psychoanalysis doing many, many different sorts of things under the auspices of neutrality, right? Including like sponsoring dictators in the dirty war in Argentina, things like that. There's lots of little stories there.
Just little stories. Yeah. Like
little stories. Yeah. So I'm interested in how these two stories can exist at the same time, right? And like what we might then think about the clinic and the kind of work that it's doing around political concepts. Yeah. And that's the academic side to get us there to the
And thank you. I appreciate it kind of setting the stage. And you kind of reference this. Why politically neutral when psychoanalysis feels like it can speak to so many other things? I believe you mentioned religion, you mentioned art. Why do we like it didn't have to be neutral with those things, but when it came to politics, it had to be neutral? Is there a particular reason for that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think one of the way I'll maybe start by answering it is that the idea of neutrality, like I'm criticizing the idea of neutrality, and I do throughout the book, and I maintain that position. But I think it's also important to understand that the idea of neutrality in understanding politics or anything else is actually, what it's intended to do is as a safeguard for the patient. Yeah. Right? Like, so the idea of psychoanalysis, as distinct from anything like psychiatry or other psychological sciences, is that you can come in, you can lay down on the couch, and you can say anything that comes to your mind without any kind of social prohibition, right? You can talk about your most violent fantasies. You can talk about your darkest thoughts, your hatred of your mother, your hatred of your husband or wife, right? Your ambivalence about your children. You can have the space and the permission to let the most kind of unconscious, conflicted, inconsistent parts of yourself out without the analyst judging you, right? And so that's the idea of neutrality in its best iteration, right? Is that it's a space that gives social permission to the very conflicted nature of what it is to be a human being. And that was always Freud's belief, right? That human beings are conflicted. So when it comes to politics, then that would be an extension of this ideal of neutrality. Is like, well, if a patient comes in and, let's say that they're a member of an alt-right organization and they, want to spout all of their racist thoughts, but they've somehow wound up in a psychoanalysis to begin with, it isn't the analyst's place to chastise them for their views. Equally so, if a patient comes in and, they want to they're really upset about what's happening in Gaza right now. They're really upset about the murder of George Floyd. They want to talk about that. It isn't an analyst's position to agree or disagree, chastise, censure, encourage, etc. And so, from that, right, we have a kind of an open space for a different kind of relationship than you might encounter in the wider social world. And in a lot of ways, I'm very much in agreement with that position. And my advocacy throughout the book is not that analysts should adopt the role of activists, right? It's not like that that analysts should, in understanding their work as political, suddenly say like, yes, you have the alt-right patient, the neo-Nazi patient on your couch, and it's your job to turn them into, consciously by arguing with them or by, like persuading them or whatever. It's your job to turn them into kind of like a racially progressive, kind of democratically minded citizen. That's not my point throughout the book. My point is rather in trying to understand the implicit ways that an ideal like neutrality actually covers over how deeply kind of ethical and political much of psychological and psychoanalytic practice is. And that's what each chapter sort of picks through, are these different concepts, things like authority in the consulting room, reparation in the consulting room, emotional security, that many analysts take as like a naturalized fact of what it is to be a human being. And I'm saying, well, is it actually a naturalized fact? If we actually we look historically and we look socially, maybe these ideals and then the way we engage with them in the clinical realm, maybe these are actually deeply political concepts. And understanding them that way allows us to think about them more critically. Do we want to agree with these then?
Can you give an example? And I'm sure this kind of goes throughout the book, right? Like when you say emotional security, how is that a political concept?
Yeah. So this comes from the final chapter on my in my book on a psychoanalyst named John Bowlby, who is the progenitor, the creator of a style of psychoanalytic thinking, psychological thinking called attachment theory. So many people, maybe in the audience or just sort of around, will be really familiar with attachment theory because it comes with these like helpful little designators that have worked their way into like popular psychology discourse, like secure attachment, anxious avoidant attachment, right? These are the categories that are the consequence of John Bowlby's psychoanalytic theorizing himself. So when we think about like different parenting styles and like attachment issues in children, when we use that language of like secure attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, right? We're using John Bowlby's language implicitly. So that's something to kind of begin with and name. And this has worked its way into many different corners. It's in parenting books, but it's also in like books about relationships now. The book Polysecure has become really popular among queer folk, young queer folk, and that draws on John Bowlby's work as well. So this is like, it's sort of saturated in our culture. So in that regard, I think that unless you're thinking sort of really critically and self-reflectively about the ideal of security, it can seem like, oh yes, we all want emotional security, right? Like this is an uncontestable virtue. But when I was working through the archive of Bowlby's work, and when I was thinking about emotional security, especially in the history of psychoanalysis, it's actually sort of a bizarre ideal to emerge. Security hadn't been a way that psychoanalysts or psychologists talked about what an ideal way of being in relationships was, up until, really interestingly, the Cold War. So
I know, I was like, the way that you attach it, sorry for interrupting, but just the way that it like reflects like what's going on, you're almost like, huh. Anyways, it's yeah.
Yeah, it was one of those, like, sometimes in the archive you'll have these moments of just like my God, It all fits together. I understand now. And it was one of those moments for me. So, what I trace in that final chapter of the book is the co-development of two different languages about security. State-based languages about security, where you have a new ideal of national security coming out in 1947 with the National Security Act, and then emotional security, which John Bowlby proposes and which gains ground at almost exactly the same time. So national security is like, it's very much a Cold War language. It's a Cold War political language. Before that, we had national interest, we had manifest destiny, we had different empire, right? Different other forms of empire and colonialism, of course, different justifications for what the state was doing. And it's only through the Cold War, especially in the West, right, the Anglophone West, the United Kingdom and the United States, that national security becomes the thing that the state is trying to do for itself. Now, at the same time, you have a really influential psychoanalyst promoting emotional security as the thing that the mother and the psychoanalyst ought to provide for the child and the patient. And so in that way, there's a deep political collaboration between the two. And the argument that I make in that chapter, it's not so much that Bowlby is like mimicking the discourse of national security. Rather, I think about the way that the popularity of Bowlby's theory as answering a deep insecurity that citizens throughout the nation state were feeling. So it's more like they're like symbiotic and compensatory. And the fact of security's continuing and intensifying popularity as an emotional vocabulary right now speaks to me to the increasing forms of insecurity that citizens are experiencing, right? In the midst of gun violence, in the midst of climate crisis, in the midst of ever widening economic gaps, alt-right Christo-fascism, the world is getting arguably more and more and more precarious for people. And so, of course, a vocabulary like emotional security becomes more and more and more attractive to folks.
Yeah, and so of course with John Bowlby, yeah, you're talking about how it applies today, and it's very popular today. But I mean, you're talking about the bomb in that time, like
Yeah.
like people. It's weird because I didn't have to do this, right? But I talked to my parents, and I don't think about they had to do drills where they were told, "Hey, go get under your desks," and it's not going to do anything. Like, it's.
Yeah.
I actually was talking to therapist the other day who she was talking to her child in the store, and her daughter said, "Mommy, I was afraid that man was going to pull out a gun and shoot us." And that's not like news. It's many kids in this generation now have fear. I didn't worry about gun violence in schools, right? Like that's not. It wasn't my. And so yeah, like you could see like how the threats are responded in that way, and it's interesting to see it respond to each in different threats. Do you think some of that is just also kind of a semantic like use, and I won't say overuse of the word, but like proliferation of a word? So
Mm.
so he picks up on security probably because he's hearing it in national security, or do you think there's any of that?
So in my work, I'm not terribly interested in like a single origin story for a
Right,
concept.
right,
And while the word security is certainly interesting, what I'm more interested in is the way that this concept balloons at a particular historical moment across a number of different fields. So it absolutely might be the case that the word is overused. I mean, my every time I have a first year student who's like, well, when are we going to study attachment theory and secure attachments? There's the part of my brain that's like, could we not think about relationality in any other, like, must we,
yeah,
please,
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah,
must we?
right.
Yeah, but I tend to think, like, in my own approach to kind of the history of psychology and psychoanalysis and clinical practice, I tend to think about the kind of development of a concept rather than like its origin point. I think it's really
Right.
difficult to cite a particular origin. So whether or not it was happening in the political sphere in debates about national security first, or whether it was happening with Bowlby first, is a bit less my concern, and it's a bit more like, why has this both of these conversations become so popular, and how do they collaborate with each other or against each other, right? Like, why has this become the way that we're understanding both the human being and the nation state? Like, why this narrative? What is this doing for us, and what is it limiting us from doing as well, right? Like, how does it enable, but how does it prohibit? And so that's the kind of toggle that I engage in every chapter throughout the book. So the book is in no way a kind of an argument about psychoanalysis's conservatism. Far, far from it. It's an understanding of the bivalent nature of the inherently political concepts that are often taken to be naturalized fact.
Forgive me. It's just the way that you talked about the security thing reminded me. I had Colin Webster on, and he talked about how technology and uh, the history of thought kind of follow each other. So, for
Mm,
instance, he was talking about medicine in this regard. They talked about there was uh, air and blood was supposed to be in the same circulatory system because the only pipes they had were not pressurized in back in Grecian times. And then in
mhm,
Alexandria, they created pressurized pipes. And within 50
mm.
years, a guy in the court wrote, "Hey, I think there's two circulatory systems, and the blood system is pressurized." Right, and it's that same thing of like, uh, like someone's going to make the connection, right? And so, anyways, it's really, I don't know. That was like a connection in my own brain. Yeah.
No, it's absolutely right that we use that there's this constant collaboration between the metaphors that we have about the human mind or human functioning, and then the metaphors and technologies that we have in the world. And to give a psychoanalytic example, which is it's absolutely what you're saying about kind of the circulatory system versus like pipes and the way that they work. Freud oftentimes thought about the human body through the emerging language at his time of thermodynamics, right? So he was using kind of scientific discoveries in thermodynamics to understand the libido and the different kind of pressurized functions of the human body. And so, and this is like, the scholars in science studies and feminist science studies will oftentimes argue that, or it is one of their basic claims, that scientific knowledge is human production, right? Scientific um, insights and theories are produced by human beings, and they bear the mark of that throughout history. It's not to say that they're wrong, right? This is no advocacy for like a absolute abandonment of kind of scientific knowledge. It's just to acknowledge that like all human thought is human produced, including scientific knowledge, and we use metaphors and language and the kind of available narratives that we have at a historical moment to understand the world around us, and that those are constantly shifting.
Yeah, and those metaphors have strengths and weaknesses, which kind of goes into like a lot of what you're saying with, you have these different, in a lot of ways, metaphors that are being traced through this history, and each one has, they're not neutral. They have strengths and weaknesses for different people groups, for different, but I digress, and anyways. As we look at kind of that beginning, you talk about democracy's children and Anna Freud and like the idea of on good authority. Even as we look at kind of the distance, there is an enormous amount of authority for for the practitioner, right? What are you tracing from the political side through Anna Freud?
Yeah. Yeah. So Anna Freud, for anyone who might not be deep in the archives of psychoanalytic history, like I happen to be at this moment in my life. Anna Freud was the daughter of Sigmund Freud. She was the only of Sigmund Freud, founder of psychoanalysis, this like distinct way of thinking about the human mind as the unconscious is the truth about what it is to be human. This is Freud's unique contribution to thinking. Anna Freud was his youngest daughter, born in 1895. And she considered herself psychoanalysis's twin throughout her whole life because she was sort of born at the moment that Freud was inventing psychoanalysis. And so she was the only of Freud's children to take up his professional calling. She lived with her father throughout her entire life. She studied and became a psychoanalyst herself, qualified very early on as one of the first female psychoanalysts, and she became one of the founders of child psychoanalysis, which was like a development off of an offshoot of psychoanalysis that Sigmund Freud and his kind of bevy of disciples and acolytes were kind of experimenting with at that time. So Anna Freud in the 1920s was developing child psychoanalysis as distinct from adult psychoanalysis, where they worked with primarily neurotic adults, would have been the language that they were using at that time. And so in when you're like creating a discipline from scratch, you're sort of trying to figure out what works best and what to do. And one of the interesting things that I explore in that, like the first part of the book, which is the first 2 chapters, is the extent to which psychoanalysts were absolutely mystified by what sort of creature the child was. Like absolutely mystified by it. They came up with any number of different theories about who children were, how they functioned, that were so wildly divergent from each other. And yet they all sort of believed each of them was right individually. But this is sort of true of child psychology and psychoanalysis throughout, is nobody can quite agree what sort of being the child is. And so they're all kind of contest each other about this is the way that they function, no this. And so for Anna Freud, she's working in the 1920s. There's no settled theory about what the child is. There is certainly no diagnostic rubric about how to go about helping children who have emotional distress. And, she was when she was working, we have to remember this is the end of World War I. We're watching amplifying anti-Semitism and racism happen throughout Europe. There's the major shifting and reorganization of national boundaries that happens as a consequence of the close of World War I, right, where kind of Austro-Hungarian empire is departitioned, becomes ethnic nation states, all these changes, right? So children were having kind of predictable emotional responses. And so she's working in the clinic, and one of the early concepts, and this is what it takes us to authority, one of the early concepts she experiments with is the idea that the psychoanalyst needs to adopt a position of authority in relation to the child, that they essentially need to stand in for the parents and kind of provide a good enough or good authority that on the one hand won't allow the child total free license to do whatever they want, but on the other hand isn't overly strict and stringent that would, in a way that would encourage the child to become, in a psychoanalytic understanding, obsessional or but like overly self-censorious, right? Like overly self-critical, overly inhibited, overly fearful, whatever. So this was a really contentious position for Anna Freud to adopt, the idea that the analyst should adopt a position of authority in relation to the child. Because certainly her father, the founder of psychoanalysis, was not advocating for the analyst to be an authority figure. But Anna Freud was saying that when you're working with children, you actually need to be an authority figure for them. You need to do all these things because children are very different from adults, right? And so you have to do different things with them because they're so very different from adults. And so that's what Anna Freud was doing in her clinic. And in that chapter, what I think about is the connection between that emphasis on authority and then, as I was just mentioning, the really seismic political changes that were happening throughout Europe at the time. So, throughout Europe after World War I, you have the kind of decommissioning of a lot of these huge imperial structures, right? Like the Austro-Hungarian Empire gets kind of ethnic states get created in the wake of it after World War I. And the emergent vocabulary instead of empire is newly democracy, right? Mass democracy starts to gain ground, politically speaking, throughout Europe for the first time in that kind of historical moment in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And so I'm thinking about Anna Freud's really sort of baffling. It's like a baffling attachment to authority, right? Like, why? Why do you need authority? Why this? Like, everybody is telling you that this isn't really psychoanalytic, yet she clings to it for a while. And so I'm thinking about this as representing a sort of a clinical grappling with the decline of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the rise of mass democracy, which was also really hotly debated at the time. Like, we think about democracy now as being like, yes, it's the thing that we want. It is the political good,
right,
especially in the West, right? That's our idea of democracy. But that understanding of democracy only really became popular after World War II. So it was only after the genocide, the Holocaust, right? It was only after a kind of mass racial genocide that, and the failure of fascism alongside that mass democracy became sort of an incontested political ideal. And so at the time, in the 1920s and 30s, people were pretty suspicious about mass democracy. It wasn't universally embraced. Lots of folks wanted a return to empire. Lots of folks wanted the authority that was represented by that. And so I read Anna Freud's sort of attachment to authority in the clinic as a political grappling with the rise of mass democracy and the status of, like, the questionable status of authority within mass democracy, right? If you don't have an imperial ruler, who do you look to? How do we establish the authority even of a constitution? And so I think about these two things as kind of informing each other, right? Her kind of attachment to authority in the person of the analyst, and then the changing status of authority politically.
Is it hard not to psychoanalyze Anna Freud when you're like, do you find yourself just like, why, Anna, are you so attached to authority with,
It's it's the constant pitfall, I think, of working in psychoanalysis, is that it always can turn back around on you. So there are funny stories of, like, and early psychoanalysts were especially unboundaried in their willingness to engage in these kind of ad hominem attacks. So a psychoanalyst named Ernst Jones once called Anna Freud a tough and indigestible morsel. And he suggested, yeah, it's a great language, isn't it? A tough and indigestible morsel. And he suggested in a letter to Sigmund Freud himself, right, founder of this movement, and Ernst Jones is one of his one of his followers. He suggests in a letter to Sigmund Freud that Anna Freud's failures as a psychoanalyst are due to her being improperly analyzed. Now, that is important because Sigmund Freud was the
yes, it's like,
who had analyzed his own daughter. So there's all of this, like, if only you weren't so neurotic, you could see that, right? Lots of Freud's fights with his male disciples, including like Alfred Adler and Carl Jung, really famously, like the end part of their relationship ends with these letters between the two, with the two kind of psychoanalyzing each other and saying like, yes, but it's because you're like, you've got a father complex, and you couldn't see this possibly because you're too attached to X. So it's like, it's a popular style.
Yeah. I mean, that's I read Freud in college, and I think I got like through is it On the Origins of Dreams? Like is that the title? And there's a good it's a good month of, you just like have to get it out of your system. You're like, man, I could just do that. You can analyze like that forever. Like there's always it can be it could be that kind of trap. So I was curious if that still happens to, people who are well versed in the field. So
Absolutely. I mean, personally, I think it's a bit of a pitfall, especially engaging if I'm having a conversation with friends, right? I'm willing to do a different style of thought than I am in my own academic work. But I think academically, it's a bit of a pitfall, precisely because, I guess, the first reason is because we don't have access to the psychologies of any of these people. All these folks that I'm talking about are long dead, right? So to assume that based on anyone's published work or their reputation or a historical archive, that you could ever make a truth claim about the mentality of another, of that person, I think that's a methodologically, I think that's a methodological failure. So that's like one side of it. And the other side of it, I think, is that it's like, one of the things I resist in psychoanalysis is the extent to which it can become this, exactly what you're describing, this recursive, all-consuming style of thought. And I think that is I feel like that's a dangerous way of engaging in this interpretive project that psychoanalysis offers. And it just leads to less living and more, more kind of self-cannibalizing, self-reflection.
It's like the psychological version of doom scrolling, right? You could just sit like kind of that morbid introspection. You've talked a little bit about authority you used with Anna Freud slightly differently. But as we talk about the political neutrality and what the goals are, what is good, and the authorities we use to determine what is good, and kind of how do we navigate a shifting framework? Is there kind of a two-part question? So I'll just start with this. You've talked a lot about the political side of it. Is there, does that kind of, the word political is used a lot, but I feel like we're getting into some philosophical, moral, and ethical questions as well. And so, I love, talking about the interdisciplinary side of things. How far afield do you feel like a lot of this goes into kind of like those philosophical and ethical questions?
It's a great question. It's also one of the questions I get asked almost every time I give a talk is, all right, so by the political, what do you mean?
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's an important question for me, because in my I have a distinct understanding of the political that's very informed by feminist theory and by decolonial and postcolonial theory. So for me, I would say first and foremost, the political for me doesn't just stop at the water's edge of state policy or, voting or electoral politics, things like that. It's not just about the state. And this understanding of the political really comes from, I would say, first, my deepest grounding in it is in a history of feminist theory that understands that what has been nominally understood as the private sphere is deeply political, right? So for instance, who does the housework, who does the childcare, why it is that certain forms of emotional care are, partitioned to certain bodies, et cetera, that these aren't just personal questions, or rather that they are personal questions, and that in the famous feminist mantra, the personal is political. right? And so a lot of early feminist work, throughout the 60s and the 70s in the United States and then in the United Kingdom as well, was really engaged in, this kind of project of consciousness raising, which was a way of saying that like these things that you thought are your issue or your problem, these difficulties that you've been having are not in fact privatizable, and that the private sphere is really determined by the public sphere, and that these two things interact and you can't separate them, right? Like, so from a Marxist feminist point of view, why is it that women do all this, free, what Marxist feminists would call reproductive labor? Well, it's because then they support the kind of the male breadwinner going out and doing productive labor, and then the capitalist gets to keep all of the surplus of the reproductive labor that women do in the home. And that it's a functioning system, right? But it's a system that shortchanges women who do all this unpaid work that then gets like shuttled out to the capital. And like that's the Marxist account of it. But this is like my way of saying it, that first and foremost, the political is also the personal and the private to me, because I kind of come from this feminist background. The second part of this is that almost at many points throughout the book, I use a hyphenate phrase, the ethico-political. Yeah. And I mean that really intentionally. So when you're saying that we're getting into ethical territory, I think that's absolutely right. And I think I'm always thinking in terms of ethico-politics. This is a phrasing and framing that Foucault uses as well, especially in some of his late works when he's thinking about ethics and care of the self stuff. But for me, it has to do with understanding that when we're trying to create imaginaries for justice, when we're trying to organize states and distributions of resources, when we're thinking about what the right framework for governance is, or how we kind of make reparation or whatever, those are political projects. But if you follow them back about like, well, why should we be doing these things? What is the justification for them? The place that I always arrive at is that it's because fundamentally these are political projects that work on behalf of ethical ideals, right? Ideals about how we should treat one another, relational ideals about how human beings should relate to and be treated by one another. These are ethical systems inherently. So I think at the level I come, I build back down to the level of the personal and the interpersonal in my understanding of why we should or shouldn't hold certain political ideals is because fundamentally political systems are ethical systems as well. And so we need to understand that when we're arguing for things like justice, it's because this has an inherent ethical capacity to it. And so throughout the book, if kind of you're looking through the book, you'll see I oftentimes use the shorthand of the ethico-political, because I think the ethical is inherently political because it's about how we should be with one another. And then the political is inherently ethical because it's about how we should be with one another.
One tremendous answer. It's almost like you've been asked that before. This is brutally simplistic. But yeah, and a lot of what I when I get the chance on the show to talk about language that crosses disciplines, so you're going to have epistemological questions that are part of this and metaphysical questions that are part of this. So of course there's like philosophical, not in the sense, and this is where this does get brutally simplistic, and I apologize to whoever's listening, but not that that epistemological and metaphysical questions are deeper than the ethical or the political questions, but in the sense, and I think it's been a long time, but I think it was reading Wittgenstein, this idea that we have explanations that provide anchor points and they support each other. And so your decisions about epistemology are not necessarily the foundation for your political or for your ethical, but they do tend to secure each other in terms of like kind of like more like a net and like the knots in the net rather than kind of some classical epistemologies where it's like brick by brick and you're like, well, if you pull out this one epistemological brick, the whole thing falls down. It's like, no, I would probably find an epistemology that's like, I just believe in treating other people equally. So I'd probably find a different, you know what I mean? Like a different support system. And so is that a kind of a fair way to think about it? Like you're not necessarily getting into philosophical, but like there is like, you can see the strands leading off to some of those anchor points, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to think about it. And I would say that like the interaction between the ethico-political and the epistemological is like, I come from the position of the
Yep.
ethico-political and I'm looking at a field that is primarily epistemological, right? That's interested in truth claims. So lots of clinical psychoanalysts, especially those who have been traditionally trained, who are more on the orthodox side of things, um, lots of those folks think about their work as it's like an inherently or implicitly an epistemological pursuit. They're interested in truth, right? They believe a truth is, and I'm not, by saying they believe, I'm not trying to criticize this because truth is important to me. And it's an important project that psychoanalysis and psychoanalysts engage in. But when they're doing their work, they're interested in truth. It's an epistemological project. Each psychoanalyst, from John Bowlby to D.W. Winnicott to Melanie Klein to Sigmund Freud to Jacques Lacan, all of these psychoanalysts have their own epistemological and interpretive systems that they're working with. And psychoanalysts who are working in the wake of these folks, work in those epistemological traditions. So they're interested in truth, and they're trying, when they do their writing and when they practice, they're trying to pursue this form of truth. And so just like you were describing with the nets, right? I come from a sort of different angle and a different training. And I'm like, yes, I mean, I think the elaboration of truth is a really important project, but we can't lose sight of this other half of the equation, right? Which is that there is no epistemology separate from an ethical political ideal, right? That there are many truths. And this is a kind of way of thinking about science that goes back through like Thomas Kuhn,
Right.
and Michel Foucault, certainly, but that understands that truth is, again, it's historically contingent and it's historically contestable for that reason. And so I come through this kind of ethico-political angle, and I'm like, yes, but what about the other knots in the equation, right? There are many ways of constituting truth, and there have been in the history of psychoanalysis many established truths that we would today have great issue with. For instance, the idea that gay and lesbian analysts are pathological, right? This was a cornerstone belief, a truth claim among psychoanalysts in the mid-century in the United States and in the United Kingdoms that held for a really long time, and that I think you can still see the legacies of. Psychoanalysis, has been used by different by different folks, different institutes, to justify colonialism, to justify those who are living under colonial rule. And I'm thinking of a psychoanalyst named Octave Mononi, who wrote a very famous book that Frantz Fanon critiques. But Mononi was to some extent not exactly justifying colonialism, but certainly pathologizing those who were colonized as, to some extent, psychologically needing that colonization, right? That they were, in his words, they had a dependency complex. So those are claims that now, right, those are truth claims that were accepted at the time, that we would now have great issue with on ethical political grounds, and that we have different truth claims that we make now in accordance with our ethical politics.
And this, I think, is part of where a book like yours fits in, because you have the clinical work, which is very important and has done good work for people and bad work for people. Obviously, we're talking about.
Yeah.
um, and you see, like, look at someone like Frantz Fanon, who their critical work, his critical work, made I'm sorry, not clinical work. Excuse me, academic work made the clinical work better. Uh, I know I want to be respectful of your time, but if you don't mind, can we talk a little about the decolonizing side of? Because I feel like we kind of we hit the two other major sections. So I would love to hear a little bit about how decolonization, and I think it's a good follow up to these questions of different epistemologies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way that they inform the psychoanalytic pursuit.
So Fanon, he trained as a psychiatrist, and the typical story about him is that as he was working as a psychiatrist in France and then in North Africa, he became and seeing the effects of colonialism on his patients as he was seeing them. Right, he was seeing people who had been tortured by the Free French Army, or not the Free French Army, that had been tortured by kind of colonial forces. He was seeing people who'd had who are kind of having internalized nightmares because of colonial racial regimes. And so the typical story about Fanon is that as he's seeing more and more of this in the clinic, he becomes more and more disillusioned with psychiatric work and turns towards his anti-colonial activism. And this is a really reductive account that is, in my estimation, and I think many historians now would say this, it's an inaccurate account of Fanon, because even when he resigned from his psychoanalytic work in Algeria, he continued, and in France, he continued to practice as a psychiatrist, right? He took up other positions as a psychiatrist, and he continued to meld his psychiatric work, for instance, in the hospital he was working at called Bly de Joinville. He continued to meld a psychiatric work with his political work. So as you put it, his political commitments really deepened and transformed his psychiatric understanding of the clinic. So he's one of the most famous, I would say, figures who uses psychoanalysis in his published writings especially. And he wasn't a psychoanalyst, he was a psychiatrist, but he was reading Jacques Lacan, and he was really informed by psychoanalytic thinking in his own kind of conception of what he was doing, regardless of how he was trained. So he's like the most famous post-colonial and decolonial figure who uses psychoanalysis and uses it to try and understand the limitations in his work, especially with Arab patients in North Africa and Algeria, the limitations of the psychoanalytic clinic traditionally understood. Because he was like, the things that are working in the clinic for like the colonial white women he was treating were not working for his Arab and Muslim patients. They were just not working. And so he was understanding that there was something culturally specific and racially and religiously specific about clinical treatments that had been taken to be objective, right? And he was like, these are, and so he redesigned things for the Arab patients that spoke to their ethnic backgrounds better. And he understood this to have a huge impact on the quality of their treatment. There's lots more to say about Fanon, including the fact that he was almost always working through a translator because he didn't speak Arabic. So he had his own kind of colonial legacy as a French citizen in that regard. And he was Black, but from Martinique, and Martinique has a kind of heightened status in relation to French colonies. It's a complicated place. Yeah. But he was just one of many different psychoanalysts and psychiatrists who were using psychoanalysis for varied ends. So one of the little stories I can tell, and I'll be mindful of time as well and try and be brief, but one of the little stories I can tell is from the 1970s in Brazil. And it goes like, when people refer to it, it's called the Lobo affair. And it speaks to these two sides of how psychoanalysis is a political project. But so it sort of begins with a figure named Amilcar Lobo, who is in training in Brazil in 1973. So he's like a psychoanalytic trainee, and he's also working for the military dictatorship as a torturer. So he's training in a psychoanalytic society that either doesn't know about this or willfully turns a blind eye to it and accepts it. He's training at a psychoanalytic society and then moonlighting as a torturer for the secret police. So this information becomes public through the work of a psychoanalyst named Helena Besserman Viana, is I believe how you pronounce her last name. And she finds out that this trainee, Lobo, has been working as a torturer for the military dictatorship, like the rising military dictatorship. And so she takes these documents that prove that Lobo has been low-key torturing, like actually just torturing people on the side.
You want to say low key because you don't want to admit the horror of it. It's not low key.
He was not low key.
High key.
It was like on the down low, like he wasn't exactly promoting it, but he wasn't really hiding it either.
Right.
But he was just torturing people. And so she passes these documents that prove that Lobo was a torturer over to another leftist analyst working in Argentina in 1973, right? And dirty war starts in 74, so things in Argentina aren't great either. She passes this over to a psychoanalyst named Mimi Langer, who's Marie Mimi Langer, who is a leftist figure working in Argentina at the time, in order to help out Lobo as a torture for the secret police. Now, Langer gets all this stuff together and gives it all to the IPA, the International Psychoanalytic Society. The IPA's response to this, instead of saying like, my gosh, what a scandal, we must disqualify this person, right? We can't accept this. Instead of doing that, the IPA gives all the documents back to the training analyst who's overseeing Lobo's supervision, the supervising analyst, who's a man named Leo Cabernetti, who was Nazi trained himself. So they give all of this documentation back, including the fact that Besserman Viana was the whistleblower. So, and that allows the Brazilian Psychoanalytic Society at the time, that was, in complicity with Lobo, to identify Besserman Viana as the whistleblower and like essentially out her in this political conflict. So I tell that story because, in Latin America at this time, we are dealing with military dictatorships in the global South, and you have these two kind of conflicting views about what psychoanalysis should be doing, acting themselves out in this really dramatic way, right? Besserman Viana being like, psychoanalysis needs to not be in alignment with military dictatorship, right? Like its project cannot be one that's allied with state repression and torture. It must understand its political project to be a progressive and leftist one. Whereas Lobo and the Psychoanalytic Institute, right, the IPA, were essentially saying, nope, it's fine if we're allied with military dictatorship, right? This isn't in conflict with our values. Jacques Derrida calls this out later in a very influential piece of writing called Geopsychoanalysis and the Rest of the World, calls out the IPA's complicity with the dirty war in Argentina, especially. And so in this story is important because it shows the different ways that psychoanalysis has been used in relation to colonialism and decolonization, right? It has absolutely been used as an apologia for colonialism, as a defense of state violence, as a defense of various forms of torture, both psychological and physical. But it has also been used by figures like Fanon, by figures like Murray Langer, by figures like Besserman Viana, as a advocacy for and a contestation of colonialism. And so you can see the malleability of psychoanalysis when it comes to colonialism really well.
I would love to draw us to a close here. One, that's such a beautiful picture of I think you've used the word bivalence throughout. So like the two very like crazy paths. You have the story, and then just that clear outline of how it's been a tool of one side and a tool of the other. I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how much I appreciated at the end of the book. You kind of, as you're talking about politics and psychoanalysis, a lot of my own work has been in philosophical hermeneutics and specifically like interpreting art. And a lot of people push for politics and art, and they'll talk about it. And it becomes a justification for bad art because it's politically what they want. And I really appreciate that you kind of warn against this pitfall in You're like, psychoanalysis needs to do what psychoanalysis does well. That will include some political stuff, but the point isn't to make it political, because that becomes an excuse for bad psychoanalysis. So one, thank you, because I have great faith in Columbia University Press, but I was like, okay, so how is this going to, sometimes you end up reading one of these, it's like, we just need to like have just this, like, and it's like, no, like you have to make sure that it's done well, right? And so I appreciate that. I appreciate that kind of self-awareness. For our listeners, and I know a lot of what you're addressing is going to be to kind of the clinicians and the psychiatrists and to the academic world of psychoanalysis. But even for, if you can have something for our listeners just throughout the week, what is something you'd have them think about as kind of a takeaway from today, our interview?
Yeah, I suppose it's gonna be like a really shallow answer, I think. But like, I suppose just a recognition of the extent to which mental health concerns and mental health practices correspond with our political reality, right? Like that's just kind of the base both the kind of anxieties we have, the fears we have, the desires we have, and the vocabularies we use to understand them, but then also like the practitioners we sort of go to see and how we try and take care of ourselves. That all of these things, they're deeply bound in the place in which we're living, right? They're deeply bound in the place in which we're living. So I guess this is the feminist background in me. My background is in literature and gender studies. Like I think that convictions about objectivity are wrong-footed from the beginning. I think that we need to think about an ethico-political schema, not an objective, not an investment in objectivity. I think objectivity oftentimes operates as a cloak for really dangerous beliefs and ideologies. So I'd always just kind of encourage people to reflect on the extent to which we are, to use Donna Haraway's language, situated, right? Our own situatedness. And this applies as much to our kind of ways of understanding ourselves and the way we process our world as it does to the kinds of practices, however varied, we engage in to try and kind of take care of ourselves in this like this new slow apocalypse we've all found ourselves in. So that would be my closing, my closing suggestion.
Shallow or deep, I do think it's incredibly practical and helpful. So thank you. I appreciate it. And it's been a real joy talking to you today. Thank you, Dr. Laubender.
Yeah, thank you so much for the time.